If you don't think altering your consciousness is part of human nature, then why do 5-year-olds spin in a circle till they fall over? Okay. Why do 7-year-olds hyperventilate until they start seeing stuff? So this idea that, a certain segment of the population wants to go off to the Amazon and have hallucinogenic snuff blown up their nose. Okay, count me in. But
is that the Yopo? That's the Yopo, right?
This weird little branch on the evolutionary tree is not true. All people everywhere have had an interest in altering their consciousness for therapeutic purposes, for inspiration, or for boredom.
Hey, listeners, and welcome back to Third Waves Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Austin, here with another episode on this third wave of psychedelics. And today we have Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin, who will join us. Dr. Mark Plotkin is a renowned ethnobotanist who has studied traditional indigenous plant use with elder shamans of Central and South America for much of the past 30 years. He wrote a book, which I have read, called The Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice in 1994, and has really been one of the foremost thought leaders and researchers on the use of plant medicine specific to the Amazon. So I wanted to bring him on the show today to talk about all things ethnobotany, to hear a little bit about his background and story, and then hear his thoughts and perspectives on this current psychedelic renaissance that we find ourselves in. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us for the show.
Paul, great to be here.
So one of your mentors, probably your foremost mentor, was Richard Evans Schultes, who you sent over a number of resources on beforehand. You know, I heard of Schultes when I read Plants of the Gods many, many years ago. As I was starting to get into the space, and he's really been, a godfather in terms of to people like you, to Terrence and Dennis McKenna, to a number of ethnobotanists that have helped to Wade Davis as well, that have helped to pioneer the ethnobotany space. And so I'd love just to open our conversation with your reflections on how you met Richard Evans Schultes, what your relationship was with him, and what were a few sort of key things that you took away from your mentorship and learning from him.
Well, I had a close and essentially very unique relationship with Schultes. Like many other people, from Wade Davis to Andrew Weil, I just wandered into his classroom and I was hooked right away. And this was actually in a night school class. I was a college dropout at the time, and one lecture of Schultes, and I saw the path in front of me. So I worked closely with him. I not only took every course he taught, I took several of them several times. That's how rich they were. And, for those of your listeners who aren't very familiar with him, and I'm sure everybody is to some degree, Schultes was a work-study student at Harvard in the early 30s, mid-30s, and did such an excellent paper on peyote that his mentor, Oakes Ames, who was the director of the Botanical Museum, which Schultes later took over, sent him to Oklahoma to study peyote firsthand. Now, Schultes was a poor kid from East Boston, and he said to me at the time, everything west of the Hudson was Indian country, literally. So climbing into a used, beat-up old Studebaker with a graduate student named Weston LaBar, who then eventually went on to become a great anthropologist in his own right, after a night in that teepee taking peyote with members of the Kiowa tribe of the Native American Church, he was lost to medical school forever. Not to medicine, but to medical school. He then followed up on a hunch and a clue he found in a herbarium and solved the mystery of the magic mushrooms. Nobody knew there were magic mushrooms in the New World. There were certainly indications of Amanita muscaria, which had long been known. But the idea of hallucinogenic mushrooms was something new to people. Many people disbelieved it. And he went down to Oaxaca and found them. So what this means, Paul, is that by the age of 26, Schultes had brought mescaline and psilocybin to the outside world. That's a feat that has never been equaled and never will be equaled by any other scientist going forward, despite all the interest and money pouring into the field. He then went to the Amazon for 6 months, went native for 14 years, and discovered ayahuasca. Now,
14 years.
Yes, 14 years. And the Schultes is quick to say, ethnobotanists don't discover anything. It's really our indigenous teachers and mentors and guides who teach it to us. So he never used the term discover. These days, it's quite a loaded term. But I think it works well in terms of describing, from a Western perspective, it was certainly essentially a discovery. One other aspect of Schultes' work with mind-altering plants, which is really overlooked, was he did fundamental work on cannabis as well. You don't see this in many of the biographies. In 1971, he went to Afghanistan to try and figure out what was what. At the time, guys like me in high school and college were smoking what we called rat weed, and that was a pretty apt description of its lack of potency. And then there was the really cool, hard to get, expensive stuff, which we call Thai stick. Well, Schultes figured that out. Cannabis, the rat weed was Cannabis sativa, and Thai stick was Cannabis indica, and then you had this weirdo species, Cannabis ruderalis. Now, in an age where everybody's crossing everything all the time and coming up with all these crazy and powerful mixtures, it's really hard to sort out the taxonomy, but I think that the work that he did really laid out that there were 3 lines of origin. So this is yet another aspect of Schultes' career, which was really overlooked by the whole psychedelic psychonaut community.
So he helped to amplify mescaline, which was being used really since probably the late, or known about somewhat since the late 19th century. And I read the little piece that you had sent over before our podcast, how he picked the shortest book in the library, thinking it would be an easy task, and then turned out it was mescaline, and his teacher said, well, you got to go experience this. So like you said, he went down to Oklahoma to experience that, went to Oaxaca, found the psilocybin mushroom, spent 14 years in the Amazon to find ayahuasca, then went over to Afghanistan to find cannabis. I'm curious, where does your story then, you mentioned that you were at Harvard and you did an undergrad class with him. How were you inspired then through the work that he had done to pursue your own career in ethnobotany, and how did that start to trickle?
I think it's important to point out that Schultes really inspired a lot of people, not just people who are drinking lots of ayahuasca these days. E.O. Wilson, the greatest biologist of our time, described Schultes as a personal hero. Dan Goleman, who wrote important work on psychology, described him as an inspiration. So that Schultes as a persona in some ways was as large as Schultes as a person. And just to finish off on your earlier question, I went off to forestry school after I finished my degree at Harvard and Night School. I spent 2 years at Yale. Schultes always referred to that as slumming. And then I came back and worked at the museum as a research associate directly with him. And when I was deciding to move down to Washington to work for the World Wildlife Fund and had to give up my apartment, Schultes said, just move into my attic. I'm an empty nester. My wife and I have a big old house. So I actually lived with him for 6 or 8 months. And the reason I mention that is we spent a lot of time sitting in front of the fireplace in New England winter, drinking scotch, listening to tales that didn't show up in the Botanical Museum leaflets of Harvard University. So when I say that I had this unique relationship with the man, it wasn't that I took most of his classes or hung around with him more. It's just that I saw him in different settings. So that as a mentor, I would put him up there with, the great archetypes of like Merlin or Obi-Wan Kenobi, except he was a real living, breathing human. And the other point I want to make is that, Schultes was at the epitome of academia. A tenured professor at Harvard, publisher of hundreds of papers, yada, yada, yada. But he was also one of the funniest people I've ever met. He just had this unbelievably hilarious, droll manner, which I'm convinced was one of the secrets to making friends with people, whether they were in academia or Indians living in the Amazon, which was, I think, part of the secret, part of the key to his success in building these relationships, because ethnobotany is all about relationships. It doesn't matter how much money you have or what degrees you have or how interested you are. You can't just show up and say, fork over a cool admixture of ayahuasca or teach me how to cure cancer because I got to get back on campus in a week. It doesn't work that way.
It does not. How would you define ethnobotany then as a practice or as a profession?
I think that my description is a bit broader than some. People think of ethnobotany as searching for medicinal plants in the Amazon, following the shaman with your plant press. Hey, I'm cool with that. But I think that's a narrow definition. To me, ethnobotany is people and plants. So the study of all people and all plants is ethnobotany. If you're studying a farmer in a cornfield in Iowa, that to me is ethnobotany. Some people would say that's economic botany because that's the study of plants that have economic value. So I think that ethnobotany is a much broader canvas, and that economic botany fits within there rather than vice versa.
And ethnobotany, I know this podcast in particular will talk a lot about psychedelic plant medicine because that's what we focused on. But ethnobotany is very broad. It's all types of medicines in all types of ways and how those interact with, the local indigenous population. That's pretty accurate, correct? It's very expansive.
Well, let me tell you a story, an example of why it's important to have these relationships and to be focusing on the plants, because nobody, when I got there 30 years ago, 40 years ago, nobody was going to indigenous peoples and saying, teach me. Okay, so that was a really different dynamic that created an immediate relationship. But 35 years after I was working with some of these people, we're sitting around, and I mentioned that indigenous peoples to the far west, 3,000 miles away in Peru, used a hallucinogenic frog. And they said, oh, we do that here. And it turned out to be the same frog. And then they showed me a new hallucinogenic frog, which has never been reported in the literature. Now, this is 38 years of friendship and partnership before they essentially coughed up some new information on a mind-altering creature. And the point I want to make here, Paul, is that, this whole idea like, well, we went to the Amazon and we got ayahuasca and we went to Oaxaca and we got mushrooms, we're done. I totally reject. There's more out there. And the more we look, the more we find. The irony that here we are in the psychedelic renaissance celebrating peyote cactus, celebrating magical frogs, but we're destroying these organisms and these cultures faster than ever at the very same time.
Right. And there's a phrase that's often used now, which is indigenous reciprocity. What does that phrase mean to you and all the work that you've done in indigenous reciprocity over the last 40 years, in particular as it relates, because this is something you wrote about in the Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice quite a bit, right? In the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of Western companies that went down, took out plants or medicines, and then created them into molecules to profit from them, right, without properly acknowledging where it came from. So I'm just curious, your perspective on that.
Yeah, I'll give you a real easy translation of indigenous reciprocity. Good manners. Okay. You want people to help you. Why shouldn't you be helping them? And the idea that just give us the plant to cure AIDS and we'll be back in 16 years with $1 billion. That's no longer an acceptable way of doing business. And I will say that most of the big monies that were made from medicinal plants were in the distant past, not recently, okay? So the psychedelic renaissance, in a big way, is about the rediscovery of natural products. And one of the things that fascinates me, I'm spending a lot of time on, is this whole issue of psychedelics for therapeutic purposes that have nothing to do with their psychedelic aspects. And in a broad sense, this matches what I know you spend a lot of time on in terms of microdosing. Here's a concrete example. Charles Nichols in New Orleans, my hometown, has been studying the effect of tiny amounts of psychedelics in treating asthma very successfully. Okay. So the idea is that, well, yes, we know that these affect the human mind and psyche and spirit, and we can sometimes cure things that Western medicine cannot. But guess what? These chemicals can sometimes have a positive therapeutic effect on things that have nothing to do with your psyche. Okay. And that's what makes this endlessly fascinating. And I'm frustrated when I see this reductionist approach, like, I need to take ayahuasca 90 times and discover the secret of life while the rainforest is burning down. You're missing the point. Okay. When I hear people taking, I took ayahuasca and I figured out Bitcoin. Like, really? That's what you did with this sacred knowledge? I mean, good, I guess. That wouldn't be at the top of my priority list in terms of what we're using these things for. So the point I'm trying to make here, Paul, is that all of us who are interested in these products, natural products, semi-synthetic products, synthetic products, should be using it to appreciate the oneness of life, the interconnectedness, the butterfly effect, which is something we all come away with. But how do you put that into practice? And that goes back to your question about indigenous reciprocity. How can you help indigenous peoples or peasant peoples or Afro-Amazonians make a better life? It's not all about the money. One of the most important things my organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, has done is partner with indigenous peoples and peasant peoples to map their lands. And we map it, we manage it, we protect it much better as a result of the maps. But we don't make the maps. Okay, it'd be easy for me to make a map and hand it to them. It's much more important and much more impactful to teach them how to make the map so they can take charge of their cultural and environmental destiny. So these types of partnerships shouldn't just be about, like, can they give me something to make me trip and then I give them a few bucks? But how can we help these people? I mean, everybody out there in podcast land knows more about making websites than I do. Every tribe on the planet should have its own website. And these types of things and ways that we can all help these people without saying, okay, let me find the cure for COVID, and then I'm going to give you guys millions and millions of bucks. That's a magic bullet approach. I'm a much more bigger believer in a magic shotgun approach. What can we do now, immediately, without involving millions of dollars or waiting decades to be able to help these people protect their culture, their land, their forests, their rivers, and deal with the outside world better on their own terms rather than white guys like you or me deciding what they should or shouldn't do.
Right. There was a situation several years ago in the psychedelic space. I think even before I got involved around 2015. It maybe happened in 2013 or 2014, where there was a group that tried to go down to the Amazon. And it's something with ayahuasca and something with, they were going to set up a relationship with local shamans and try to pay them, but it all went very sideways very quick because, again, it was these white people who were going in, who were trying to tell indigenous people what to do, and the whole thing ended up blowing up. And I think that speaks to, like you said, this sense of having manners, the sense of, and you, I mean, the name of your book represents this, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice. You went down, you apprenticed under someone who had been doing this for, years, if not generations, if not many, many generations through their lineage. And you said, hey, I'm here to learn. I'm here to be a steward and witness and observe, unfortunately, the sort of fading out of the indigenous way of being, right? I think you mentioned at the end of the book that, by the late 80s, early 90s, Western clothes, Western radios, Western food was all starting to come in, and you were witnessing how that was destroying some of that knowledge and wisdom. And yet, here we are now in a globalized world where we have to figure out, how do we live in harmony with these groups? And I think what you're talking to, it hits the nail on the head, because you're saying, we're not going to tell them, build the map for them. We're going to empower them so that they feel like they have the capacity to do what it is that needs to be done.
Well, let me give you a concrete example based on what you just said. I got a call from a guy saying, I'm putting together this consortium with these guys who are starting a psilocybin company, and we want to help the indigenous peoples, and we want to get back, yada, yada, yada. And I need to know how to do that. And I said, well, it's very difficult. I've spent decades, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned a lot of lessons. And he said, okay, so how do you do it? And I said, yeah, well, it's very difficult. It's hard to learn. It's hard to do it right. There's a lot of pitfalls to avoid. He goes, yeah, but how do you do that? And I said, look, you sent me an email saying there's billions of dollars going into your company. You don't even have a product on the market. You want me to tell you what I've spent 40 years learning for free, okay? I'm not looking to get paid here. I'm not looking for a consultancy. But you say you want to help the Indians, write the Amazon conservation team a check and show your good faith. Because this is like, the wimpy approach to sustainable development. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. And he's like, well, I'm just trying to get so I can help the Indians. It's like, dude, you're getting paid, but you're not paying the Indians. You're telling us trust you, and in a couple of years, there'll be big money. That doesn't work. So the good news is that people are talking this language. The bad news is there's a lot of bullshit involved. Put the money on the table and show us you're serious, rather than using this as a marketing line to pull in more money from investors. How you're going to help the Indians? Then you're going to sell it off, and the owners aren't going to give a shit, right?
Precisely. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I was just at a conference this last week in Miami. It was like a business medical industry conference. And I'm someone who's always in the psychedelic space. I've focused on non-medical, non-clinical. I've been really about how we go from clinic to culture. And there's just a lot of buzzwords and a lot of phrases. But when you kind of start to dig, it's a lot of emptiness. And I think what we know from the indigenous use of these compounds, these medicines, sometimes for thousands and thousands of years. We trace back the immortality key and the Eleusinian mysteries and ayahuasca and the Amazon. There's so much richness and depth there that you can't just sort of, you get the top of the iceberg, and actually you really need to go deep and live and be present and experience that if you want that to be part of your company, right? I myself, we've taken a much more Western approach. It's not necessarily that. We do have some reciprocity measures that we've implemented, but I think if that's what you're presenting, then go do the hard work. Go spend the time in the Amazon. Go spend the time with the Mount Mazatec or whatever it might be.
I think we're looking at a continuum here. If you look at alkaloids like the curare alkaloids, which were muscle relaxant abdominal surgery early on, they've been completely replaced by synthetics. Okay, some chemicals, you can collect them. That we looked at stuff in the herbarium at Kew outside London, stuff that had been collected over 100 years ago, like the original ayahuasca alkaloids, are still active. Okay, so an alkaloid is an alkaloid is an alkaloid. However, I reject the idea that a physician who took a class on this in medical school can do with psilocybin what some of the great shamans in Oaxaca can do after studying it for 60 years. Okay, so it's not either or. But this reductionist, let's just get the mushrooms and grow them in the lab and we can fix everything. No, that's not true. Now, the flip side of that is there aren't enough shamans to go around. Not everybody who's interested in these plants or fungi or frogs can go down there and take things in a shamanic setting. That's a given. But the idea that let's just get the chemicals out of the rainforest or the tundra or the desert or wherever and put them in the lab and we can do everything that a shaman can, trust me. It's not going to happen. So that you need to have all of this buffet laid out if you want to do it right. And instead of this idea okay, I'll start a company and I'll sell psilocybin, I'll make $1 bazillion and I'll give the Indians a few pennies. Not acceptable.
And it's interesting that you're bringing up this at this point in time. Compass Pathways, who I'm sure you've heard of at this point in time, just released their phase 2B trial results, right? They enrolled 233 people in psilocybin, and the results were okay, but they weren't great by any stretch of the imagination, right? And that's, I think, to your point, it's because when you remove the complexity, when you remove the shamanistic approach, right? Because so much of it is psychosomatic. So much of it is not necessarily purely physiological, but it's how you prepare, and it's often nonlinear, right? You talk about the example of, I was listening to another podcast, your foot hurting for a lot of time, and then you went and saw a shaman and they healed the foot. And if you try to explain how that happened, you couldn't. But yet you were in that context and in that dynamic, and something was done to remove that energy. And these are not things that can necessarily be reduced into X, Y, and Z.
Here's one of my many quarrels with Tim Leary. He talked about set and setting, and everybody's always citing that. He missed the most important S, shaman. Okay, set, setting, and shaman. The aspect of ritual, the chanting, the diet, whatever, is important and even essential in some of the cases, not all of them. But this idea that, just give me the cure for X and I'll go back and I'll give it to people in a syringe or whatever and we're cool with that. That's too reductionist. You're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, there's the famous case of Paul Stamets, who I'm a great fan of, where he took psilocybin and cured his own stuttering. Fantastic. That does happen. That's not a unique case. But the idea that we should all, climb a tree in a rainstorm and tell ourselves, don't have insomnia, don't have acid reflux, don't be anxious, all this other stuff, that's going to work in some cases, but not all of them. And I'm not even sure how many. So that it shouldn't be an argument of shaman versus, buying the stuff on Amazon.com. We should have that buffet in front of us if we really want to get it right.
I'm glad you brought up Timothy Leary, because one way that you referred to Richard Evans Schultes was as a trickster. And Timothy Leary had a similar archetype, as a trickster, so to say. They both were at Harvard. They both were very well established academically, and yet the way I would say, of course, Timothy Leary is much well known culturally than Richard Evans Schultes to some degree. But I'm curious from your perspective, both are tricksters. What's the difference? Why was Schultes who he was, and why was Leary who he was, and what was the gap between them?
Well, I never met Leary, so I can't comment on him in the same perspective as I can with Schultes. When I say Schultes was a trickster, I mean that in the most positive shamanic sense. He was a guy who looked like the most conservative nerd in Harvard Square, always wore a white lab coat, always wore a Harvard tie, always had his wire rim spectacles. But he was the original wild man. I mean, doing all of this stuff in a tribal setting. Many's a time he'd be walking across the Harvard Square chewing ipadu, this coca powder from the Colombian Amazon. I remember once he was walking back from Harvard Square to the museum, which is just north of the square. And this is at the height of the drug hysteria. And one of the deans said, "Hello, Richard, how was your last trip to the Amazon?" And Schultes said, "Oh, it's great. We found a new hallucinogen," which, of course, is the last thing a Harvard dean wanted to hear. But this is how he was. Another time, he used to love to go to these Nobel Prize receptions because so many Harvard profs would win Nobel Prizes. And he would always go up and say stuff like, "Well, Brian, congratulations." And the fellow would say, "Well, thank you, Richard." And Schultes would say, "Brian, by my tally, there's about 12 or 13 Harvard professors who've won Nobel Prizes, but there's only one that had a genus of Amazonian cockroach named after him." So this is who he was. Whereas Leary is a trickster, I'm not sure. I think I would use trickster differently with him. I mean, the man started some very important research with convicts, with religious leaders. That type of work is being replicated today, but they just kind of went off the rails by my reading of it, that they lost the scientific approach, which is necessary for gaining respect in Western circles, as we're doing now. And I think that some of this overemphasis and sensationalism really set the field back many, many decades. And fortunately, we live at a time where we're realizing the value of what these indigenous peoples told us long ago, what Schultes was saying all along. So it's both gratifying and frustrating that we lost so much time.
Well, just in talking about this, what's coming up for me is it seems like Schultes understood that these medicines had a context, right? So when they were used in the Amazon, there was a very specific context that they were used within. And Leary took a much more evangelical sort of, let's just give everyone acid approach without really honoring sort of the lineage and the context in which it was done. And so both recognize the potential and power of these plants of the gods, so to say, but it feels like Schultes understood boundaries. Right? When he was at Harvard, he was a Harvard man. He wore the white coat as he needed to. He cracked the jokes that felt appropriate. And when he was in the Amazon, he was the wild man participating and being with that. It seems like with Leary, it was just a little more about Leary rather than about the healing or the medicine itself.
I think that Schultes took a much longer term approach. And I like to think that our organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, is continuing his legacy for trying to protect these traditions and trying to protect these forests rather than saying, wow, I could make a bunch of money or get a bunch of attention by giving the world ayahuasca or psilocybin or who knows what we'll find next. And I think that's a much more respectful approach in terms of the cultures that give birth to it. And that the idea that, that you should be doing ayahuasca in a longhouse with an ayahuasca shaman is the right way to capture the real magic and therapeutic aspects of it. I mean, this is something that I don't think many people have access to. Certainly, I don't know that Leary ever did this with a real traditional healer, even though he took mushrooms for the first time in Cuernavaca. It's in Mexico, but it's a suburb of Mexico City. It's not Oaxaca.
And it was at a resort with like 8 white friends. I remember reading the stories about it. So it wasn't with, a Mazatec or anything like that, like Gordon Wasson did.
Right.
But
there's one aspect of this which I find that very few people interested in these subjects realize, which is that beta blockers, to a large degree, were inspired by compounds in the magic mushrooms, and they were developed by Albert Hofmann, which is a name I'm sure familiar to many of you guys. So this goes back to the point that I made earlier in response to your question, which is that there are other applications that don't have to do with the psychedelic aspects of this. These are chemicals which have a strong effect on the human body, and that if we're just looking at the psychedelic aspects, the entheogenic aspects, I think we're once again sort of selling them short, literally in some cases.
Let's go into that a little bit. In terms of microdosing, is that something that's used by those who have been using this in the Amazon, those who have used this in Mexico, is microdosing a thing whatsoever for performance or for hunting?
I've never heard of it.
You haven't? Okay.
But you know what that means? That means I've never seen it. I've never heard of it. Ethnobotanists do not say indigenous peoples don't do that, or indigenous people. Because if you'd have asked me 30 years ago if indigenous peoples took hallucinogenic frogs, I'd have thought you were hallucinating. So this is why you say I haven't seen it rather than it doesn't exist. I don't suspect that it exists, but one learns in this field never to say never. However, I'm intrigued to tie in this whole microdose idea to this work this fellow's doing in New Orleans, which I think you can make the case is kind of microdosing and proving it has therapeutic effects, even though it's not what you're looking for. So I suspect that microdosing is like a Pandora's box in a good way, where we're just going to keep finding new and useful aspects to it, which may or may not have to do with anxiety or depression or focus, and may have some very valuable aspects for things we weren't even looking for in the first place. Which brings me to another point, Paul. We all know that quinine was the first effective drug for treating and curing malaria. But in the 50s, when malaria was common in this country, that many people taking a quinine bark or quinine bark aspects had their cardiac arrhythmias cured. And that was because it turns out there was another alkaloid in the bark called quinidin, which wasn't a malaria fighter. And that, this was used to treat malaria, and they were curing something else with it. And I think that's probably going to be a predictive analogy for what we're going to find with things like microdosing, where we do different approaches, even then the indigenous peoples know are used, and find out their additional therapeutic applications. So that's why I find it frustrating when people just want to talk about ayahuasca, just want to talk about psilocybin, just want to talk about LSD, when they're missing the point that there's more stuff out there. I'm convinced there's more stuff out there. We'll find more stuff out there. And the more stuff out there that we can find and protect and honor and reciprocate, the better off we'll be.
I did an interview with James Fadiman. I don't know if you know of James. He wrote the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide 8 or 9 months ago. And the point that he brought up was microdosing is like the AM dial and high doses are like the FM dial. You're still tuning in to the same transmission. You're just getting a slightly different interpretation. And he compared microdosing to aspirin, right? Where aspirin, when it was discovered many, many years ago, it was only at these higher doses. But what they found out is if you took very little doses more consistently, that it could help with heart issues. And so all of a sudden, this new way of working with aspirin opened up. And it feels like microdosing is, like you mentioned, the work of Dr. Nichols at LSU. He's looking at the anti-inflammatory properties. Mm-hmm. So how does it help with the central nervous system? What's the relationship of microdosing to the gut and the serotonin in the gut? And now that could open a new pathway for dementia, for asthma, for all of these inflammatory issues that previously we had no context for necessarily.
Exactly. And, again, another point to make with all of these medicines, natural, synthetic, semi-synthetic, is that there's still diseases that will come up that we don't know. I mean, if we'd have done this interview 5 years ago, you would not have asked me what indigenous peoples use for COVID, right? And the idea that COVID is the be-all and end-all is nonsense, okay? So, 30 years ago, people were all about AIDS, treatments for AIDS. So, again, we have to not only find treatments for new diseases, we need better treatments for existing diseases. There are treatments for depression, and they're very effective in some cases, but not in many, which is why microdosing or even macrodosing provides new answers. So, again, it argues for the need to keep looking, keep experimenting, keep working in the lab, keep working with the shamans, keep protecting forests, coral reefs, wherever. But we can't just figure that, okay, we got this good stuff and we can close the door, not worry about the poor rainforest, and just figure, well, we've got everything that's out there to get. It's absolutely not true.
I kind of want to open that up, right? Because one of the phrases that you've used is that the Amazon is the world's biggest medicine cabinet. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that and sort of expand on that.
It's a basic ecological theory that as you move towards the equator, you get more and more species. That's why rainforests are so rich. And because they're so rich, there's an ongoing battle between organisms. Remember, plants can't run away, so they have to evolve chemicals to fight back. there's tens of millions of insects that live in the rainforest, and fungi as well, that are very poorly known, very poorly studied. But that doesn't mean that the local plants can afford to not worry about it. The rubber tree didn't evolve rubber to make the Industrial Revolution possible, which it did. It did it to gum up the mouth parts of insects that were trying to chew on the bark. So that if you want to look for places where you're going to find new things, you need to find where the diversity is. Now, this is not to argue that all of the great new drugs are in the rainforest. It's not true. It's just there's likely to be more of them because there's more species, there's more chemical warfare, there's more alkaloids. I mean, if you look at the way that we were able to do surgery where immunosuppression is very important, like organ transplants, that comes from a fungus. It comes from, I think, Norway originally. So this shows you that it's not all about the equator. However, there's just more there. And I would never argue that we need to protect the rainforest and, to hell with everything else. No, it's all connected. But that it just makes sense from what we know that there's going to be more potential there. And let's face it, there's more species threatened in the Amazon or in the Congo than there is in Austin, Texas, or Arlington, Virginia.
Right, and unfortunately, it's now burning. Right, you wrote the op-ed for New York Times, which we'll link to in the show notes, about precisely that, how that relates to I think this is in the COVID era as well, and it's devastating because when the world's biggest medicine cabinet is burning, we're losing all these potential medicines that could be helpful for diseases that we're aware of or even that we're not yet aware of, which is too bad.
Well, when you look at how much information is coming out on psychedelics, I mean, not a week goes by there isn't some major article in a place like the Wall Street Journal, State and Stolid, talking about spiritual experiences from taking mushrooms. Who knew? Very seldom is there any emphasis or even a mention about how important it is to protect everything else that we don't know, which is common sense. So that to me is very frustrating. And again, when people say to me, well, the Amazon, it's really getting hammered. Is the glass half full or half empty? Well, any glass that's half full is half empty. It's half full. We have all this interest that we didn't have 20 years ago, but it's half empty because we're burning it faster than ever. So that is my frustration. And this is why we at the Amazon Conservation Team do what we call biocultural conservation. And when you went in Schultes' office, there were two pictures right behind him. One was two indigenous members of the Yukuna tribe snuffing during a ceremony, and the other was Chiribiquete, which is the largest rainforest park in the world. So it was nature and it was culture, and they weren't separated, okay? So all this emphasis on new medicines from nature, or even old medicines from nature, there needs more emphasis on new potential medicines from nature, and the people are going to teach them to us. I can't think of any major hallucinogen, natural hallucinogen, that was discovered in a laboratory. I mean, you had people like Sasha Shulgin creating them, but for the most part, they were based on natural models. And the more natural compounds we have, the more we can use technology to create semi-synthetic or even synthetic ones based on the natural stuff. I mean, that's what beta blockers are, right? They're inspired by stuff in the mushrooms, even though there were no beta blockers in the mushrooms themselves.
And there are still probably dozens of hallucinogenic plants that we don't know of, that haven't found.
Could be more, could be less. But you know what? Right. Let's protect all the pieces and find out.
Exactly. Well, let's get into that a little bit. Plants of the Gods, right? This is a new podcast that you've launched in the last year or so, I believe. And I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about what inspired that initiative and what is it that you cover in Plants of the Gods generally.
Well, the obvious answer is inspired by Schultes' book, which to me is the most impactful book I ever read, Schultes and Often, Plants of the Gods, which talked about how these entheogenic plants and fungi were really the basis of a lot of aspects of Western civilization, religion, art, music. And, I just think most people don't look at the world through the lens of how it was impacted by these sacred plants and mushrooms. And that book laid it out. So I wanted to do a podcast. I mean, there's lots of excellent podcasts. There's yours, there's Joe Moore's. There's a lot that really aren't so good, but that's okay. I mean, that's the great thing about podcasts. Anybody can have a voice. But I thought if I'm going to do something, I want to do something different. And because I'm an ethnobotanist and because I've had the honor and privilege of going through so many ceremonies with these indigenous peoples in Oaxaca, in the Amazon, my perspective compared to the other podcasters I've listened to is fairly different. And the idea is not to replace anybody. The idea is to be complementary. Okay, your perspective complements mine, and that's what I'm trying to do. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I want to invent a new wheel, which fits on the wagon with all the other wheels. And by virtue of the fact that I was one of Schultes' last students, again, I think weaving in his legacy and to talk about what he contributed and why it's important is part of my mission here.
What are your 3 favorite episodes so far that you've had a chance to record for that? I listened to the one that you sent over, which was about Wasson and Hoffman, and which I loved. It's when you talk about the beta blockers, which I had no idea.
The Holy Trinity of ethnomycology.
Yeah.
And the Holy Trinity is Schultes, who first discovered the mushroom from a Western standpoint, Wasson, who followed up and did much more on that, who then brought in Hoffman, who isolated and then synthesized psilocybin. So that was undeniably a major advancement for world civilization. However, there were 2 people left out of that Holy Trinity, and that is Wasson's wife. Wasson's wife was a physician, and any ethnobotanist worth his salt knows you need to be talking to doctors just to get a fuller perspective. A doctor cannot do what we do, but it's always useful to have a professional alongside, as well as anthropologists and linguists. It's not just all about doctors, but she was a physician. So she's never really gotten the credit I thought she deserved in terms of the medical aspects of this whole story. Second is Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina was the shaman who, gave the mushrooms to the Wassons. And how can you talk about a Holy Trinity and not have, Mother Mary essentially being part of it? So that was a very popular episode. The most popular, ironically, is The Life and Times of Richard Schultes. And then one of my favorites is Plants of the Apes, how animals, particularly monkeys and other apes, are using plants for medicinal purposes, everything from anti-infectives to contraceptives. It's a very cool story. And when I ask my mentors, the shamans, where they learn these plants, they say, we learn them in dreams, we learn them when we take hallucinogens, and we learn them by watching the animals. So that, I'm trying to expand it. I mean, here's one thing I've done with Plants of the Gods, are very different. Schultes and other people who write about hallucinogens or have written about hallucinogens do not talk about liquor for the most part. Okay? So I did one on the ethnobotany of wine. Wine is the most important plant product in the evolution of human culture, except for the cereal grains and corn. If you look at the Romans, and that was a central part of their culture, Tacitus, the poet laureate, said, no poem was ever written by a drinker of water. Okay? So if one of the reasons we're celebrating these substances because they alter the mind, they alter the mood, they lift depression, they inspire us to sing and dance and write poetry, why not include alcohol? It has to be part of the story. And so in that sense, I'm trying to amplify the perspective to saying that anything that manipulates or changes your consciousness needs to be considered part of this movement, this renaissance. I mean, and Andy Weil, and people know Andrew Weil as this guru who brought alternative medicine to the fore, but what very few people realize, he was a Schultes student. Okay? He was an undergraduate student of Schultes, and it was Schultes who put him on that path, even though he went off to medical school. And Weil wrote in one of his first books that if you don't think altering your consciousness is part of human nature, then why do 5-year-olds spin in a circle till they fall over? Okay? Why do 7-year-olds hyperventilate until they start seeing stuff? So this idea that, a certain segment of the population wants to go off to the Amazon and have hallucinogenic snuff blown up their nose, count me in. But
is that the Yopo? That's the Yopo, right?
This weird little branch on the evolutionary tree is not true. All people everywhere have had an interest in altering their consciousness for therapeutic purposes, for inspiration, or for boredom.
All valuable and viable reasons from my perspective, right? And the immortality key laid that out. I don't know if you've had a chance. I feel like you've probably heard about it, or at least seen some things as it relates to it. But what was laid out in there is how wine was then infused with myrrh, and wine was infused with other psychedelic substances, and that it's no coincidence that wine was the sort of drug of choice of Dionysus, and then also the drug of choice of Jesus Christ and Christianity. And obviously so much of what we are as a culture and society goes back to that. And yet in the psychedelic space, and I would say I've been somewhat guilty of this as well, I've done my fair share of drinking, and there's a lot of not so nice consequences sometimes if you drink too much. And I think some people see, mushrooms or ayahuasca as being more spiritual or being more pure or being more, you don't have a hangover the next day. And yet I would agree with you that wine with friends is just as, if not a better way to bond and connect and live compared to mushrooms. So it's all on as you mentioned before, this is all on a continuum in many ways.
In my, I did an episode on the ethnobotany of wine where I talked about the fact that, yes, alcohol does have a downside and a negative side. So does opium. Okay. So do most of these things. And it all needs to be used under supervision and in the right amount. As Paracelsus 500 years ago said, the dose makes the poison. If you don't think that's true, eat 500 aspirin. You'll be dead as a doornail. So the idea is, how much do you do? How much is necessary? How much is right? I mean, I've been through many, many, many ayahuasca ceremonies, probably close to 100 at this point. And if the shaman says, have another cup, I do it. And if he or she says, no more for you, I don't do it. And I did a marijuana trilogy for Plants of the Gods podcast, and I pointed out that if you give 5 guys all the liquor they want, they'll end up in a fight. If you give 5 guys all the marijuana they want, they'll end up in a band.
I love that.
So,
what if you give them all the acid that they want? What happens then?
If you give a guy all the liquor he wants, he'll be going down the interstate at 105 miles an hour. If you give a guy all the dope he wants, he'll be tearing down the interstate at 15 miles an hour.
There you go.
So some of these mind-altering substances have safety controls built in.
Right.
But the point is, how can we best use them? I mean, what's Western medicine's cure for depression? Doesn't have one. Okay, you and I know that there's incredible results coming out from these labs with psilocybin and MDMA. And is this a panacea and a cure-all? Of course not. But we're curing some cases, improving many cases that weren't responding to Western treatment. So again, this once again argues that it's not the shaman versus the doctor. Okay, it's the microchip and the medicine man. Right, that offers the best path forward. And that's why wine is a good treatment for depression in light cases, if you're drinking just enough of it. Okay, it doesn't mean you should go out and get trashed and smashed and think it's going to cure any serious problem. But a glass of wine, I mean, now they're finding it's therapeutic. Gee, who knew that except the Romans and the Greeks and the Phoenicians and the Sumerians and everybody else? The first medical prescription written was on a cuneiform tablet from Iraq. Okay, so wine
Babylonia
is the first
or
recorded
Sumeria? Right. Wow. And so one thing we haven't really touched on a whole lot yet is your own story with these medicines. When did that start for you? I know you were at Harvard in the late 60s, early 70s,
right?
Which was sort of, within just after that second wave of psychedelics, just after the counterculture. Was this something that you became interested at in university, or wasn't it until you went down to the Amazon that you started to work with hallucinogenics in a way?
I'm a child of the 60s. I grew up in the 60s. I got to Harvard in 74. I mean, I grew up in New Orleans. I smoked my share of dope as a teenager. So this is what people did. It wasn't like it was a realization that just fell out of the sky or stuff. New Orleans is where marijuana first entered the U.S., and that is why jazz was invented in New Orleans, because it changed musicians' sense of time. So this was never new to me. Okay, and this ethnobotanical explanation for the origin of jazz and why I came from New Orleans, I mean, I haven't heard a better explanation. So when I got to Schultes, and when I got to Harvard and took Schultes' class, and I heard this very staid and stolid Harvard professor saying, go down there, live with the people, hunt with the people, drink with the people, eat with the people, take ayahuasca with the people. I'm like, okay, I'm in. So it wasn't like, all of a sudden it was a rapid change of career. I was lost to law school forever. I was interested in exploring. I was open-minded. I was looking for romance and adventure. I mean, who isn't at that age, right? Just that I found a path I'm still on, I think it's fair to say.
How old were you when you went down there? Was this right after university that you made your way to the Amazon then? Or were you first at the museum and then eventually
I took
found your way
Schultes
down
class when I was 19, and
there?
that hooked me. And I was working in a museum, the Harvard Museum, now known as Harvard Natural History Museum. I was working at the branch known as the Comparative Zoology Museum, which was adjoined to the Botanical Museum, which is adjoined to the Peabody Museum, which is the part that's best known. And I was working as a gopher in the herpetology department, and there was a graduate student there named Russ Mittermeier, who was like the Indiana Jones of the time, spoke 7 languages, went off, for years at a time. And he said he needed some help on an expedition in search of an endangered lizard that nobody had been able to catch. It was a bright blue, gigantic lizard.
Oh,
so
cool.
I signed on. And I went and we found it and we collected it.
You found the lizard?
Yeah, we found the lizard. So
what's the name of the lizard?
It's a blue amaiva. Amaiva is a big lizard. In Venezuela, it's known as a come huevos, an egg eater. It looks like a cross between let's see, how would I describe it? A cross between an iguana and the really badass dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. These are big honking carnivorous lizards. But I mean, they're about this long. They're a meter long. We're not talking about carrying off small children. But, to a kid grew up reading dinosaur books, this was like landing in the middle of a fantasy. And they're bright blue. I mean, who's ever seen a bright blue lizard?
That's cool. Yeah, you expect that with the frogs, but not the big lizards, right? Yeah. So you're down in the Amazon, and then ever since then, that was 30, 40, 40 years ago now almost. You've been in and out. You set up a nonprofit. What's kind of just bring us through the trajectory of your career from when you went down and found this big blue lizard until where you are now.
Well, I was down there nominally as a herpetologist, which was to catch lizards, which I did. But I saw the people using all these plants, which I was frankly more interested in, having already taken Schultes' course. But, when you're a kid, life's a buffet, right? You got this that looks good, and this looks cool, and this looks interesting. And, my dad sold shoes for a living. It's not like I followed in the tradition of Plotkin ethnobotanist. And frankly, most people then, and like many people now, didn't know what an ethnobotanist is. I just kind of made my way. So I went to forestry school because I wanted practical hands-on knowledge. And then I went back to Harvard to work with Schultes, who said, if you're going to be a scientist, you need to get a Ph.D., but I'm stepping down, so why don't you go to Tufts, right next to Harvard, because I can be on your thesis committee, which I can't be at Harvard because I'm retired. So I was simultaneously working for the World Wildlife Fund, working at Harvard, and going to school at Tufts. And then I got a job at World Wildlife Fund. Schultes had retired. I moved down to D.C. I worked at World Wildlife Fund for about 8 years. I then went to work for Conservation International. And then I saw that there was an incredible opportunity and a need in the Amazon because the best preserved lands were indigenous lands, but nobody was working with them to help them protect rainforest and rainforest culture. And that's why my wife and I set up what's called the Amazon Conservation Team to focus on protecting culture and biology. And that's our origin. And we've had the honor and privilege of partnering with over 100 tribes, 100 South American tribes, to map, manage, and improve protection of 90 million acres of ancestral rainforest. And I've been asked more than one occasion, if you're so good, how come I've never heard of you? And it's because I spend all the damn money I raise doing the damn work. We don't do direct mail. We don't put up billboards and all that other stuff. Our donors' money goes where it's supposed to, which is right into the rainforest.
Congratulations. And thank you for that work. 90 million acres. And you've been doing this for 20 years, 25 years?
No, 38. Yeah.
Wow. And so over the span of that time, right, as you've been tracking, climate change, and as you've been tracking deforestation, and as you've been tracking sort of the changing ways of life within the Amazon itself, what are like 3 of the biggest things that have stuck with you, the biggest insights or nuggets of wisdom over the trajectory of your career in the past 40 years?
Well, I'd say one is that traditions don't disappear so easily. The whole story of magic mushrooms is a complicated one where the Spaniards recorded it and they were horrified by it because these people were so much in touch with their religion. There's a great quote actually about peyote by an anthropologist who said that the white man goes into his church and talks to Jesus. The Native American goes into his church, takes peyote, and talks to Jesus. And so it was believed that this tradition had died out at the end of the conquest with the Inquisition and stuff like that. But old Schultes went down to Oaxaca in 1938 and found out, yes, the tradition survived. It was like down to 3 tribes, and he was able to find it. I would say that number 2, that cultures change over time. The idea that, all of these indigenous cultures were just like they were in 1491, and if Columbus had never shown up, they'd all be the same as they were in 1491, is not true. Cultures change over time. And of course, they're changing rapidly now with the homogenization of the world. Many of the shamans I work with now carry cell phones. But that's neither good nor bad. It's both. And we can talk about stuff. I mean, COVID is a perfect example. I haven't been in the forest in 14 months, which is the first time in 4 decades. But I talk to the shamans and some of the tribal leaders on a regular basis. Thank you. What's up? So that, the same technology which can undercut the culture can also be used to reinforce it. Technology is like a sword. When Columbus first landed on Guanahani Island, which is probably somewhere in the Bahamas, people still debate it. And this idiot pulled out a sword and said, "I declare these lands for the king and queen of Spain." The chief of the indigenous tribe reached up and grabbed the sword because he'd never seen metal before, and it cut him, and he bled. And I thought, technology is the same way. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. So this idea that we just have to give all these indigenous peoples iPads and it's going to save the culture in the rainforest is nonsense. You know what happens when you give guys access to the internet for the first time? You know exactly what they're looking at. And it's not cultural preservation. Okay. So one of the things this mapping methodology does is it introduces technology in a way which helps protect the culture and the forest, helps them record, grandfather's medicinal plants, helps them record grandmother's healing songs, so that this idea that money or technology or laws is all we need to protect this biocultural diversity is nonsense. It's not that easy. If it was that easy to be done already, there's a saying in Suriname that I dearly love. To every complicated problem, there is an answer which is both simple and wrong.
And what's the third?
The third thing would be that, one of the things that we got wrong with our society is that we don't sweat. Okay? Our lives are all about being in the heat, when it's cold out, being in the air conditioning, when it's hot out, and we don't sweat. And when you sweat, you're getting rid of those toxins, and when you don't sweat, you don't. And sweating is kind of a reductionist thing. The Indians say you need to purge. Okay, this is part of ayahuasca. You need to purge. You need to vomit. You need to defecate. And that gets rid of toxins that just sit in your body. And since we never purge, vomiting is considered something you never want to do rather than something that's necessary for good health. So that this whole idea of breathing in clean air and expelling toxins either through purging or through sweating is I think, one of the causes of the many ailments we all suffer, that we're too cosseted. If you look at how these indigenous people live, they get more exercise, they drink more water, they sweat more, their feet touch the ground, which ours never do. Your bare feet don't touch the ground. Where do they touch the ground? On the beach. And everybody feels great at the beach. I think there's a connection there.
Well, it's a culture of convenience, and it gets back to your point that technology is a double-edged sword, right? Technology has, in the Industrial Revolution, raised more people out of poverty than ever before, and it's created a straitjacket of convenience that essentially has made, even though we've raised ourselves out of poverty, people are way more susceptible to sickness. They're way less able to actually connect with the earth and navigate the earth and the land. They're way too reliant on these abstract things. I go back to your point about this guy who did ayahuasca and thought about Bitcoin, right? These abstract financial things that aren't actually rooted in truth, which is our relationship to the land, our relationship to community, our relationship to the earth. And it feels like once you start to strip away all that convenience, you're actually left with something that's much more honest. And I think that's difficult for people to face.
You're right, Paul. I think that we all understand the benefits of technology. We all have iPhones. We all have notebooks. We also have to understand the price that we pay and try and minimize that, because most people don't. They're just like this all the time, right? And then we wonder why we're so stressed out. And I think that hallucinogens are part of the answer. I think that microdosing is part of the answer, but there's no panacea. It's how do you balance this connection to the natural world with using technology? I have a car. I don't want to be a hunter-gatherer. One of my best friends is a hunter-gatherer, used to be a hunter-gatherer, and I see what's better and I see what's worse. So that, he said before contact, we were always searching for food. We never went hungry. We're great hunters. He says, now there's all the food we can eat. We get fat. Right? There's part of the trade-off.
Everything in moderation. And yeah, everything in moderation. So I'm mindful of time. I have one last question for you. And we've sort of talked a little bit about it, just weaving it throughout this conversation, but just sort of looking forward now. And because this podcast is about psychedelics and because of how familiar you are with the psychedelic renaissance and a lot of the things that are going on, in an ideal world, as psychedelics grow in popularity, as people become more aware of the need to take care of the earth, to take care of the Amazon as a result of using psychedelics, I think that's a hope that I have as well. What's sort of a best case scenario, if you will, of how this third wave of psychedelics plays out in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years from your perspective as an ethnobotanist, as a conservationist, and as someone who, was a mentee of one of the greatest, teachers in this space?
Well, you're Mr. Third Wave. I should be asking you. But from my perspective, the best case scenario is, first of all, these psychedelics will be available to everyone in a controlled, standardized setting, that the issue of money is resolved in favor of people who should be getting a fair share of any benefits that come from this, the financial, not just the therapeutic, that there is more appreciation for the natural world, and it's not about how much ayahuasca do I have to take before I can make money on Bitcoin, and that they're not over-celebrated and oversold as the cure for anything. Michael Pollan's book, Changing Your Mind, is replete with stories of people who had emotional problems and went to the Amazon and kind of fell apart. And all of us who've been around the block know stories about people who thought that this was the answer to everything and ended up worse off. My buddy Tim Ferriss talks about this as well. So it's very important that things be looked at in perspective, that psychedelics are not the answer to everything, that they were a valuable and potentially even more valuable a tool in our tool chest. The other thing is that we are able to create enough shamans so that you also have the ability to take this in a relatively traditional setting, and it's not just old white Jewish guys in lab coats like me giving you a couple of pills and thinking we've got it all figured out. I gave the commencement address at Tulane Medical School a number of years ago, and I said that I talked to one of the greatest shamans in Northwest Amazon, one of the premier ayahuasqueros, and I said, how long have you been studying healing with ayahuasca? And he said, well, in your age, I'm 85. He said, I started drinking the Remedio 80 years ago. I'm still learning. So the idea that, that's a medical school.
With medical school, you go for 4 years and then
it's not 3 years. And you're done.
Yeah.
It just shows you the profound humility and respect that I think allows this man to do things, or he's gone now, to have done things that our own physicians will probably never be able to do.
And just as a follow-up question to that, what is going on right now in the Amazon in terms of shamans and in terms of is that obviously it's not a job, it's not a profession. Is that a way of life that's becoming more popular with those in the Amazon as ayahuasca grows in popularity, or just kind of what's the sort of, what's going on there with training?
I was going to the Amazon over 30 years ago, and I would find the shaman and ask him or her to teach me. They would be stunned. They would be flattered. No white man had ever done this, and very few of their grandchildren, sons or daughters or granddaughters, were interested in this. So that was kind of a revelation. However, now we're looking at the other side of the coin, where you say, I want to learn from you, I want to take ayahuasca, I want to take hallucinogens. They roll their eyes. There's a great headline in The Onion that said, ayahuasca shaman dreads another weekend of tech CEOs seeking spiritual oneness. Okay. So that kind of sums it up. But the good news is it's made shamanism a respected tradition again. And it's like I tell some of my indigenous colleagues, and remember that, that traditionally very few tribes took ayahuasca. This was not ubiquitous. In the Amazon, you have between 300 and 400 different tribes. I covered this in my last book, The Amazon, What Everybody Needs to Know, came out last year. So that the idea that all shamans use the same plant, all shamans take ayahuasca, it's simply not true. In fact, you should have Glenn Shepard on the program next, a great ethnobotanist who compares two tribes living next to each other and talks about how their whole ethnomedical system is radically different. So that the idea that being a shaman is a respected profession is a very positive thing. The downside of that is you have a lot of guys saying they're shamans that they're not. I mean, the good news here is when you go to the doctor, she or he has an MD and a degree on the wall. Who's a shaman? I mean, there's lots of renta shamans in Iquitos, and that's where a lot of these problems are coming from. So we really did need a certification program. And then that gets in the issue of, how Western do we want to be and who decides who's a shaman? We've done this actually in the Northeast Amazon, and we tell our indigenous guys, maybe you want to set up a system based on what you used to do in the past before the missionaries get it, and you decide who is and isn't a shaman. So the ball is in their court to make the decision. But that's very important because it can't be all about the money because it's a sacred tradition where money never changed hands in the first place.
Right. And this is, of course, an issue not only in the Amazon, but this is an issue in the United States and North America and Europe, right? Like we see sort of therapists or psychiatrists as the shamans of Western culture, so to say. And that's a big question, even in our credentialed professional context. Who's qualified to be a therapist? Who's qualified to be a guide? Who's qualified to guide people through some of these really deep, dark moments of their lives? And there's, like you said, there's no simple answer. Every complicated answer has a simple, or every complicated question is a simple answer, but it's wrong. And that's often the case when it comes to a lot of this work with psychedelics. It's like, and this is even something that, like with Third Wave, we're trying to help with. We've rolled out a directory of vetted clinics, retreats, therapists, coaches that go through a process where we help to vet them. But we don't know everything. Like we can't vet and verify everything. So I think this challenge, so to say, what you're speaking to, will be central to the success of how this grows and develops as a larger movement.
Well, the few students, Paul, that get through the guard dogs that surround me, that ask about the future and then what the jobs are going to be. My first answer is always 20 years from now, tattoo removal will be very big. Okay. Number two, if you're interested in healing and you're interested in hallucinogens, there you go. We need more people who have expertise in this. Guides is going to be very big, right? But it shouldn't just be all about guides. You need psychiatrists, you need shamans, you need all of these things. But I mean, here's an ironic aspect of this. I get asked all the time, what's the difference between taking ayahuasca in a maloka roundhouse with a shaman and taking ayahuasca in a clinical setting with a physician? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I've never done it in a clinical setting. So, I know more about this than many, and I don't know any guides, right? So that clearly the need is there and will only grow. And now's a good time to find people who are good of heart, that really have a call to heal, that should be thinking about this as a career path. And, let's face it, not everybody can get into medical school, and everybody should go to medical school for a variety of reasons. But, massage therapy, aromatherapy, being a psychedelic guide, all of these things need to be part of the offering of people who feel a call to help other human beings, because those needs are not being met. And given the monies that are pouring in, given the soaring demand for this stuff, I mean, I can't see anything other than a bright future for people who want to do this in a professional way, be able to earn a living, and as importantly, if not more importantly, earn a decent living in the process.
And it goes back to your point about Schultes versus Leary. Schultes, when he was doing this work, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, he had that long-term view in mind. And I think anyone who's coming into this space, this is something I often vet for and test for is, what are your intentions and why are you here? Usually if it's just as, let's say, superficial as money, cut them out, because that won't stand the test of a lot of the the challenges that one might face when doing this work. But if you're really in it because you really want to help both yourself, but more importantly, others be guided through, then what I find is those people are, this is the next 10 to 20 to 30 years of my life. And it's something I really want to commit time and energy to. And I think that is a really good signal of integrity and a heart being in the right place for this type of work.
Well, that's where I like to feel like I'm honoring Schultes' legacy, because he was never about, how can I just make $1 bazillion with this stuff? Right. It was all about understanding it, protecting it, publishing it, and in a respectful way, rather than, okay, how and where can I cash in the chips ASAP? And, I run a not-for-profit. When I hear all of these capitalizations of $500 million, $3 billion for psilocybin, it's like that's not why I'm in the business. I'm glad someone's doing it. It's not me. I'm not interested. I'm more interested in the fact that the Mazatec shamans complaining to me that some species or varieties of mushrooms are disappearing because of climate change. That, to me, is something that I'm much more interested in tackling, rather than being out there proselytizing that everybody should be drinking ayahuasca. I'm the head of ACT. We're the Amazon conservation team. We're not the ayahuasca conservation team.
I love that. Well, Mark, thank you for, first of all, joining us for this episode today. Thank you, more importantly, for the work you've done in the last 40 years for the conservation of the Amazon, for the work that you've done with ayahuasca, but more generally plant medicines, for the book that you wrote, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, which I highly recommend everyone pick up. It's a phenomenal read. I remember I read it earlier this year. I woke up at 6 a.m. and would just, for an hour, 2 hours, for like a week or two straight, was just going through it because it's such a good read. And thank you for continuing the legacy of your mentor, Richard Evans Schultes. I think the work that he pioneered is still central to the lessons that we're learning in this third wave of psychedelics. And the fact that you are the individual who you are one of many, but I think in particular you're holding a lot of that. It feels very good and solid. And so I just appreciate everything that you have done, that you are doing, and that you will do for the Amazon and also for these important plant medicines.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on intentional and responsible psychedelic use.